Welcome to I Have the Power Query. Let's learn some Power Query. This is a 4-part 101 series teaching you the absolute basics of just getting Power Query working. In Part 3, we loaded our data into the data model. In Part 4, we're going to use that data to create pivot tables and pivot charts. There are two possible ways to display our data. A pivot table. You might have used these before. They are dynamic tables where you summarize the information from your main table. Pivot charts. Like an ordinary Excel chart, but it has inbuilt filters that allow you to quickly change how you are summarizing your data. Let's just do a very quick recap. In Part 1, we entered this data and defined it as a table called TBL months. In Part 2, we used Power Query to import this table. Then in Part 3, we output this data to the data model. Come up to Insert and select Pivot Table. This dialog box will appear. We've already loaded our data into the data model, so we want to select Use this workbook's data model. We'll place the pivot table on a new worksheet. Click OK and you're taken to the new sheet. You'll see the pivot table placeholder and a new sidebar called Pivot Table Fields. There are two options for the source of our pivot table, both called TBL months. The difference is the little cylinder in front of one of the tables. It looks a little bit like my logo. I wonder where I got the idea from. Click the arrow next to the data model TBL months and our column headers will appear. I want my pivot table to show me day information, so I'll drag days to values. Next, I'll drag season down to rows, and we get this pivot table instantly summarizing the number of days per season. I want to add in the average temperature for each month. I'm going to add another column to the original TBL months table called temp. I'm using asterisk and C to make it look like degrees Celsius. I'm entering the average temperature for each month. We'll need to go into Power Query for one thing. Click on Data, then Queries and Connections, then double-click the TBL months table. There's our new temperature column. I just need to set the data type as a whole number. Close and load and come to the pivot sheet. I'm going to add a chart using that new data column. Click Insert, then Pivot Chart, then go to Pivot Chart again. This dialog box appears. As with the pivot table, we're going to use this workbook's data model. But this time, we're going to place the chart on the existing sheet. Click OK, and the pivot chart placeholder appears. I'm going to drag it to where I want, and resize it by clicking and dragging one of these circles. Go to TBL months with the cylinder and click the little arrow. This time you can see temp as an option. Drag it down to values, and you'll see that the temperature has automatically summed. This isn't what I want because the chart is reporting a temperature of nearly 160 degrees Celsius. Click on the down arrow of Sum of Temp in Values and this dialog box appears. Select Value Field Settings. In this dialog box, change from Sum to Average. And I'm going to change the name of the parameter too. When you're done, click OK. The temperature is now a more realistic 13 degrees. From my data, this is the average temperature for the year. Drag seasons down to axis and you'll get the average temperature by season. We've created our first pivot chart. Now, let's add a bit of sparkle to the pivot chart. Click on the pivot chart and come up to Design. Take a look at the different chart styles. I'm going to pick my favorite. The legend is not adding any extra information, so I'm going to click on it and press Delete. Click on the title that currently says Total. I'm going to give my pivot chart a more meaningful title, which is Average Temperature by Season. Let's label the average temperature for each season. Click on the plus button at the top right hand of the pivot chart. Come down to Data Labels and select the arrow. I'm going to have my data labels as a data callout. Finally, click on one of the bars, right-click so this dialog box appears. Press Sort, sort largest to smallest. And there we have it, a pivot chart fit for a king, or CEO at least. So in this part, we created a pivot table from our data model. We also added another column to our table in the data model to help us create a pivot chart. This concludes the 101 series. You can now go from raw data via Power Query and the data model to creating meaningful pivot tables and charts. You now know how to just get Power Query working, but the journey is just beginning. Join me in the next collection of videos as I show practical real-world examples of how using Power Query gets you what you need quickly and easily. I have the Power Query, and now you do too.